In this lecture segment, we are talking about the character of Italian Renaissance art in 15th century Florence. We will focus on a fresco, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, and a mythological image by Botticelli. We begin our discussion at the start of the 15th century in Florence. It's been about 100 years since Giotto's contributions, and since then Europe has been hit hard by the Black Death, the plague. Florence felt the brunt of the plague and a flood, and by the early part of the 15th century its population is about a third of what it was when Cimabue and Giotto were painting. Florence has become a hub for banking and cloth production. It's a democracy where guilds, like labor unions for particular professions who set rules for production, commerce, and training, run the government. Over time, elite families, especially the Medici, take over Florence's government and run the city. But there's lots of money in Florence, and where there is money, there's art and building projects. The works of art and architecture we will see teach us again about the diversity of the Renaissance and visualize some of the intellectual pursuits that characterize this period. In 1401, one of the guilds in Florence, the Wool Finishers Guild, puts out a call for entries in a competition. They are commissioning a new set of bronze doors for the baptistry in Florence, which is here at the Florence Cathedral complex. Cathedral, baptistry, and campanile. The baptistry is the religious heart of Florence and is dedicated to the patron saint of Florence, Saint John the Baptist. They ask artists who want to be considered for the job of making the new doors to submit a quatrefoil scene cast in bronze that depicts the Old Testament story of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of his faith. He's about to do it, and an angel stops his hand. This is a desirable, prestigious commission for any artist. Two of the competition submissions have survived, one quatrefoil panel by Lorenzo Ghiberti and one by Filippo Brunelleschi. The two surviving panels tell us a lot about art at this moment in time. We see clear medieval forms. Look at Abraham here with his patterned drapery and elongated body. But we also see classical forms in the way the body of Abraham here is revealed by the drapery, and the body of Isaac looks like a Greek or Roman sculpture of a god, using idealized musculature. And then in the Brunelleschi, the artist quotes from a well-known classical sculpture of a figure removing a thorn from his foot. We see potential influence from the distilled storytelling of Giotto in the way the mass of land directs the viewer through the scene here, as we saw at the Lamentation. So again, we see a melding of stylistic influences. We see connections to medieval art and classical art. Technically, we have the revival of an ancient bronze casting technique, the same technique we saw used in Greek and Roman art, and in the Bernward doors in Etonian art, lost wax casting. So even though the style is blended, the technique looks back to the ancient casting technique. Ghiberti won the competition and spent the next few decades making bronze doors for the baptistry. Brunelleschi lost and went on to become an architect whose grandest achievement is a defining feature of the skyline in Florence today. Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral solved a long-standing problem. As part of the building boom of the 14th century, Florence got a new Gothic cathedral with a plan of topping it with a dome, but they bit off more than they could chew, and by 1410 the church is done except for the dome. The diameter of the drum at the base of the missing dome is so big that they do not have enough wood to build a scaffold to construct a dome to cover it. So the crossing of the church sits open to the sky for a decade. In true Florentine fashion, they have another competition, and Brunelleschi, who lost the baptistry door competition, gets brave and enters a design for the dome that would solve the problems they currently have, and he gets the job in 1420. It is a large double-shell dome. You can walk between the shells today, and was built in concentric rings so that it could support itself as it was constructed, using a special shape of bricks in a pattern that helps lock them into position as they are placed. So it may remind you of the Pantheon, a large dome on a drum. And it is a large dome built on a drum, but it's not a classical dome. It's a medieval dome. There were double-shell domes in Byzantine architecture, and it uses elements of Gothic architecture. Picture taking a pointed arch and spinning it around to make this dome and support it using ribs. We end up with a dome that blends the medieval with innovations of the 15th century, an example of creative Renaissance problem solving. Brunelleschi designed the special shape of bricks, pulleys, and movable scaffolding to put atop on this medieval church. So what is Renaissance about it if it's not a classical dome? It is Renaissance in its evidence of new thinking, rooted in contributions of the past with innovations of the present. One of the other contributions that Brunelleschi makes is in systems of perspective. Perspective is a way of creating an illusion of space in a two-dimensional medium. Brunelleschi may have devised a way to make a 3D image on a 2D surface so that he could create images of buildings he was designing to show a patron what a space would look like, as you see here. And on the right is a recreation of a perspectival experiment in which he made a now lost painting of the baptistry using one-point or linear perspective, a type of perspective in which lines appear to meet at a single place called a vanishing point, which makes the image appear to create a recession into space. He then used his painting of the baptistry with a mirror while standing in a specific location just inside the cathedral doors, where his depiction of the baptistry perfectly melded with the physical world, creating a true illusion. A Florentine humanist, Alberti, wrote in a treatise on painting in 1435 that the frame of a work of art should be used as a window, expressing the idea that a work of art should be a window on the world and create an illusion of reality. The Renaissance was not just a flourishing of art and architecture, but was a period seeing developments in science, mathematics, and engineering, with scholars and artists reading the texts of classical authors. Experiments in perspective in the 1420s spark a flurry of interest in how to depict the 3D on a 2D surface, and we see artists using their projects to continue experimenting with perspective. Like we saw with Giotto and his experiments with storytelling in an inexpensive medium of fresco, the artist Masaccio experiments in perspective in a fresco at a church in Florence, Santa Maria Novella. This is one of the new Gothic churches built in the medieval period during a building boom to accommodate large crowds. This is a neighborhood church, with many families having lived in this neighborhood for generations. The church is entered through the cloister in a door on the side of the nave. So picture that you go in here, pass into this burial space where your relatives are entombed, and then enter the church at the side through a door you can't see in this picture that's on the other side of those trees. And directly across from you when you enter the church is this fresco, Masaccio's Trinity. Scholars think it was commissioned by a well-off couple in the neighborhood to be a private chapel for their family. In the late medieval period, public churches began to be carved up into private spaces. So for these folks, this fresco marked where their family members would be buried and where the friars could offer prayers for them in perpetuity. Families would often pay or give an endowment to a church for candles and prayers so that their situation in the afterlife would continue to improve over time. It is by the artist Masaccio, who is our first starving artist. Vasari talks about how he lived in poverty and in debt and cared nothing for himself, only his art. He dies young in 1428 after he leaves Florence for Rome. He was a part of the Florentine art scene. He knew Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. His painting here is a fresco that took him 26 giornate to paint, so about 26 days, as a giornate is the portion of wet plaster that an artist painted in about a day. The scene depicts a crucifixion, with the Holy Spirit as a dove and God the Father behind, flanked by Mary and John, and donor portraits, or portraits of the husband and wife who commissioned the work of art. The crucifixion scene is set within an illusionistic space created by one point or linear perspective. We have a vanishing point where the lines, or orthogonals, of the perspectival construction meet, and in this case, it's right at a human height on the ledge where the donors kneel. Masaccio likely worked out the perspective in a drawing that he transferred to the wall using a grid, placing the vanishing point directly opposite the eyes of a viewer to make the mathematical construction a convincing illusion. He has even depicted the halos of Mary and John, not as floating gold discs as we saw with Cimabue, but has shown them in perspective, as if they are actually taking up space. He soaked up the perspectival experiments of Florence in the 1420s and created a painting that presents an illusion of space, as if the viewer can climb up and into the scene. The diagram shows you a conception of the type of space Masaccio created. Scholars have even estimated the size of the illusionistic space behind the cross at about 9 feet deep. The structure he creates is peculiar. We see some of the language of classical architecture: a triumphal arch with a barrel vault behind, Ionic columns, Corinthian pilasters, a coffered ceiling, but he's not using this architecture in a way that it was used in the classical period. It does resemble a project Brunelleschi was working on at this time, with the arches on columns, the rondels or round medallions, and the entablature as you see here, but there was no structure in Florence, old or new, that had a coffered barrel vault. Masaccio is inventing this space, combining what he knew of classical architectural vocabulary, Brunelleschi's project, and his own imagination to create a uniquely Renaissance setting. He creates a supremely harmonious, balanced image. Look at the colors and the alteration between red and blue throughout the image. Even the coffers are alternating red and blue, and God's garment is both colors. The male donor is in red, John is in red, Mary is in blue, and the female donor is in blue. A series of triangles, a very stable form that was a favorite of Renaissance artists, focus and structure the scene. Even look at gender with the balance between female and male figures. It's a very carefully structured and planned image that stylistically embodies the 15th century Renaissance, with its combination of aspects of the classical with innovations in the present, all set within a saturated religious context. Masaccio creates an accessible image for the viewer. He uses a consistent scale for the figures and places the vanishing point at human height so that it will be a convincing illusion of a very sacred scene for his audience. At the bottom is a skeleton that scholars have determined as a funky collection of bone-like forms that do not make up a whole skeleton, with the phrase below written in Italian, not Latin, "I once was what you are now, and what I am you will become." This is a memento mori, or a reminder that all things die, so take care to be wise so that you'll be in heaven. The scene embodies the hope for resurrection after death, made possible by the sacrifice in Christ. And keep in mind that this painting is opposite the door from the burial ground, and that death and loss and resurrection would have been on the viewer's mind. Masaccio is using perspective to create a living illusion of a sacred scene, making the viewer a witness to the very act that allowed for hope in the reunion of a family in the next life. Let's look at one last variation on the Renaissance in 15th century Florence, a depiction of a mythological scene by the artist Botticelli. He was born in Florence in 1445 and trained as a goldsmith and a painter. He lives and works in the Medici Palace, the center of power for the wealthy family and the epicenter of intellectual life in Florence. This is his Birth of Venus, a scene from Roman mythology. Mythological subjects like this were becoming more and more popular in the court of Lorenzo de' Medici, the head of the Medici family in that period, who may have commissioned this painting on canvas to be hung temporarily during a procession or celebration. Lorenzo had a humanist education, meaning that he learned Greek and Latin and read classical texts. The story shown here depicts the creation of Venus from the severed genitals of Uranus that were tossed into the ocean. Two wind deities blow her to shore, and a personification of spring is there to cover her and welcome her. So this seems pretty classical, right? A classical subject straight out of the classical stories, being read anew during this period. But this was also Christian. Scholars at the time were interested in making classical thinking and stories meld comfortably with Christian ideas and theology, a philosophy called Neoplatonism. In the case of the Birth of Venus, Venus was linked to the Virgin Mary, as both were embodiments of beauty and beloved by a deity with heavenly or divine births. Lorenzo corresponded with Neoplatonic scholars who linked the Virgin Mary with Venus. The birth of Venus here from the water could even be analogous to the rebirth of baptism. There are many layers of interpretation that help to harmonize the classical or pagan with the Christian. Neoplatonism is one of the characteristics of Renaissance thinking and art, and we do see that at play in this image. And these ideas are something that Botticelli would likely have been familiar with, considering his place at the Medici court. But what about the style and how this looks? Botticelli did not use classical style in creating this image. Superficially, it might seem like it. We have a central nude female figure, and her pose does resemble classical sculptures of Venus that were coming to light in the 15th century, like the example you see on the left, from the Greek Hellenistic period, that was part of the Medici collection in the 16th century. Their poses are similar. It's called the Venus pudica pose, as the hand of the woman attempts to cover her genitals, Both female figures shown here also gesture towards perhaps covering their breasts. But look more closely at the anatomy of the body. The Medici Venus is solid, with idealized anatomy rooted in naturalism. This looks like a solid body with weight taking up space. By contrast, Botticelli's Venus has bizarre anatomy, with a long neck that has a few extra vertebrae and does not feel like a heavy, grounded figure. It still depicts an ideal, but it's the Renaissance ideal of a female body that has a torso without collarbones, a long neck, and sharply slanting shoulders. The other figures are weightless and very graceful. They have more in common with medieval art than they do with classical art. The sense of space is not rational. Items in the distance appear just as crisp as those close up, and the waves are patterned to give the effect of water, but not naturalistically looking like water. Keep in mind that this work of art is made 60 years after Masaccio's Trinity, with its emphasis on a rational, harmonious, carefully planned composition. What a contrast to this graceful, anti-scientific painting of the 1480s. In the 15th century in Florence, we have many examples of works of art that combine classical elements with medieval elements, with new innovations in perspective, construction, and theology. They are Renaissance in their diversity, showing us again that Renaissance is not just one thing.